My name is Emma Carter, and I am 31 years old. 4 years ago, I woke up to the sound of shattering glass and the acrid smell of smoke filling my lungs. In that terrifying moment, I discovered something that still haunts my dreams. Every window in my bedroom had been bolted shut from the outside. As flames danced closer to my door, I made a frantic call to emergency services that would not only save my life, but expose the horrifying truth about the people I had called Mom and Dad my entire life. But before I tell you this story that changed everything I thought I knew about love and family, I'd love to know where you're reading this from. Drop a comment below. And if you've ever felt like something was wrong in your family, but couldn't quite put your finger on it, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real survivor stories. Your support means everything, and you never know. This story might help someone else realize they're not alone in their struggle. From the outside looking in, we were the epitome of the American dream. My mother, Patricia, was always impeccably dressed, never missing a PTA meeting or church fundraiser. She organized the neighborhood book club and was known for her elaborate holiday decorations that people would drive from across town to see. My father, Robert, was a respected insurance agent who coached youth soccer on weekends and was always ready with a warm handshake and genuine smile for everyone he met. Our colonial-style home in suburban Connecticut was something out of a magazine: perfectly manicured lawn, prize-winning rose garden, and a wraparound porch complete with white rocking chairs that looked like they belonged in a Norman Rockwell painting. I was their only child, and neighbors often commented on how fortunate I was to have such devoted, caring parents. But behind that pristine white picket fence and those cheerful yellow shutters, life operated under an entirely different set of rules. My earliest memory of something feeling off was when I was 6 years old. I had invited my classmate Katie over for a playdate, my first ever. The morning she was supposed to arrive, my mother sat me down at our kitchen table with its cheerful daisy placemats and proceeded to rehearse with me exactly which rooms we could enter, what toys were appropriate to share, and even what topics were suitable for conversation. "Remember, Emma," she said, her voice sweet but her grip on my shoulders uncomfortably tight. "Little girls who can't follow simple rules don't deserve to have friends over. And we want Katie to see what a well-behaved, special little girl you are, don't we?" When Katie innocently asked to see my bedroom, my mother appeared instantly with that same bright smile she wore for company. "Oh, sweetheart, we keep certain areas of the house private for family only. But look at all these wonderful games we have set up for you in the living room." By the time I turned 8, I had begun to understand that every aspect of my existence was carefully orchestrated. My clothes were selected each morning and laid out on my dresser. Never anything too bright or attention-seeking, always neat and modest. My hair was trimmed every 6 weeks, to the exact same length, in the same style. My school lunches were packed with identical contents: a peanut butter sandwich cut into perfect triangles, apple slices in a small container, and exactly 8 crackers. Friends, the few I was allowed to have, underwent what my mother called family approval. She would research their parents, jobs, their home addresses, their involvement in community activities. Playdates were rare and always supervised, with my mother finding reasons to check on us every few minutes. "We just want to protect our precious girl," my mother would say whenever I questioned these rules, stroking my hair with fingers that felt more like claws than comfort. "The world is full of people who might hurt you, Emma. Bad influences everywhere. We love you too much to let anything happen to you." I still remember the first time I noticed the locks on my bedroom windows. I was 9, and it was a gorgeous spring afternoon. The other kids at school had been talking about opening their windows to let the fresh air in, and I wanted to do the same. But when I tried to lift the window in my room, it wouldn't budge. When I asked my father about it that evening, he knelt down to my level with that patient smile he always wore when explaining their rules. "Those are special safety locks, sweetheart. They keep bad people from getting in and keep our curious little girl from falling out. We installed them because we love you and want to keep you safe." At 9 years old, that explanation made perfect sense. After all, didn't all parents who truly loved their children take such precautions? I believed with all my heart that they were protecting me because they cared about me more than other parents cared about their children. Looking back now, I can see how carefully they crafted that belief system, how every restriction was wrapped in the language of love and protection. But then, I was just a little girl who desperately wanted to please the two people who meant everything to me. I excelled in school. My parents demanded nothing less than perfection. Teachers praised my focus and intelligence, not seeing the panic attacks I would have over anything less than an A+, knowing that disappointment at home meant days of cold silence and subtle punishments that somehow never left visible marks. While other children joined sports teams, took music lessons, or participated in school plays, I was told such activities were unnecessary distractions that would interfere with family time, which was, according to my mother, sacred and non-negotiable. My father rarely contradicted my mother's decisions. Sometimes I would catch him looking at me with what seemed like sadness in his eyes, but when I asked what was wrong, he would quickly brighten and say, "Nothing at all, princess. Just thinking about how fast you're growing up." I had no way of knowing then that those sad looks weren't nostalgia, they were guilt. And I had no way of understanding that the love that surrounded me like a suffocating blanket was actually something much darker, something that would nearly cost me my life before I finally understood the truth. The perfect family facade was just that, a facade, and beneath it, something twisted was growing stronger with each passing year. When I turned 12, something shifted in our household dynamic. It was subtle at first, like the way a storm gathers on the horizon before you realize you're about to be caught in it. What I had accepted as normal protective measures during my childhood began to evolve into something more sinister, though I wouldn't have the words to describe it for years to come. The first major incident happened when I was invited to my classmate Rachel's birthday party. It was a sleepover, something I had never experienced but desperately wanted to try. Rachel was one of the few friends who had passed my mother's rigorous approval process, mainly because her father was a respected pediatrician and her mother taught Sunday school at our church. I approached my parents with the invitation during dinner, my hands trembling slightly as I handed over the colorful card decorated with balloons and glitter. My father glanced at it briefly before passing it to my mother, who studied it as if it were a legal document requiring careful analysis. "A sleepover," she said slowly, setting down her fork with deliberate precision. "Emma, we've talked about this. You're not ready for overnight stays away from home. You have special needs that other parents wouldn't understand." "But Mom," I protested, the word, special needs, hitting me like a slap. I don't have special needs. I'm just like the other kids at school. The silence that followed was deafening. My father cleared his throat uncomfortably, but my mother's expression remained eerily calm. "Emma, sweetheart, we've discussed your difficulties, the anxiety episodes, the sleep issues. Remember when you were 8 and had those nightmares? Other parents aren't equipped to handle situations like that." I stared at her in confusion. The nightmares she was referring to had lasted exactly 3 nights, and were caused by a scary movie my father had accidentally let me watch. But the way she spoke about them now, you would have thought I had some chronic psychological condition. "I don't have anxiety episodes," I said quietly, feeling like I was defending myself against accusations I didn't understand. "And I haven't had nightmares in years." My mother reached across the table and placed her hand over mine, her touch cold despite the warm room. "Oh, honey, denial is part of the condition. Dr. Martinez explained this to us when we consulted him about your behavioral patterns." This was the first I had ever heard of Dr. Martinez. I had never met any doctor by that name, had never been taken for any psychological evaluation. But the way my mother spoke about him, with such casual certainty, made me question my own memory. As I entered my teenage years, the restrictions multiplied like a cancer. While my classmates negotiated later bedtimes and weekend privileges, I found myself fighting for basic freedoms that most 13-year-olds took for granted, like walking to the mailbox alone or staying after school for study group. My mother installed a tracking application on my phone that monitored my location every second of every day. The first time I deviated from my approved route between home and school, I had stopped to help a neighbor find her escaped cat. My phone rang within minutes. "Emma, where are you?" My mother's voice was sharp with what she called concern but felt more like accusation. "The application shows you're 3 blocks off your usual path." "I was just helping Mrs. Patterson find Whiskers," I explained, my heart racing for reasons I couldn't understand. "He got out of her yard and—" "Come home immediately," she interrupted. "We'll discuss this when you get here." The discussion involved a lecture about stranger danger and the importance of sticking to approved routines. After the third such incident, when I had ducked into the school library to return a book I had forgotten, my father began driving me to and from school personally, eliminating even those small moments of independence. At 14, I discovered that my parents had installed cameras throughout our house. Not the obvious security cameras that many families had, but tiny, hidden devices, concealed in smoke detectors, picture frames, and even inside the lamp on my desk. I found the first one by accident while cleaning my room, and the discovery sent chills down my spine. That night at dinner, I confronted them with shaking hands. "There are cameras in my room. Why are you watching me?" My mother continued cutting her chicken into precise, uniform pieces without looking up. "If you behaved in a trustworthy manner, Emma, such monitoring wouldn't be necessary. Your father and I have been discussing having you evaluated by a specialist." "Evaluated for what?" My voice cracked with a mixture of fear and indignation. My father finally spoke, though he couldn't meet my eyes. "Your mother believes you may be developing some psychological concerns. The secretive behavior, the mood changes. We're worried about you." It was the first time they had openly suggested there was something fundamentally wrong with me, but it wouldn't be the last. From that moment forward, any resistance to their control was framed as evidence of mental instability. Any request for normal teenage freedoms was interpreted as a troubling symptom of my supposed condition. My mother began reaching out to extended family members and neighbors, expressing concern about my emotional struggles. She spoke in hushed, worried tones about my behavioral issues, painting herself as a devoted mother struggling with a difficult child. She even scheduled appointments with our family physician, Dr. Hendricks, where she would describe symptoms I had never experienced while I sat beside her. Feeling invisible and unheard. "She has these episodes," my mother would say, her voice lowered with practiced concern. "Irrational outbursts, paranoid thoughts about being watched or controlled. We're at our wits' end, doctor." When I tried to defend myself, to explain that I was perfectly fine and just frustrated by their excessive restrictions, my protests only seemed to reinforce their narrative, that I was troubled and in denial about my condition. Around this time, the window security in my bedroom was upgraded from simple locks to elaborate mechanisms that required keys, which my parents kept on a chain that never left my mother's possession. Metal bars were installed on the outside, disguised as decorative ironwork that matched the shutters, but I knew their true purpose. The curtains were replaced with heavy, blackout versions that my mother claimed would help with my sleep issues, though I had never complained about sleeping. The isolation was perhaps the most devastating aspect of their control. Friends were systematically eliminated from my life through a process so gradual and seemingly reasonable that even I didn't recognize it as deliberate sabotage. My mother would express concern about various friends, influences, share gossip about their families, or create scheduling conflicts that made it impossible to maintain relationships. By 15, I felt like I was living behind glass, able to see the world but unable to touch it. I watched my classmates navigate typical teenage challenges, while I struggled with the basic human need for autonomy and connection. The saddest part was that I had begun to internalize their narrative about my supposed fragility and instability. Maybe they were right, I would think, during my darkest moments. Maybe I really was different, damaged in some way that required their constant supervision and protection. Maybe the world really was too dangerous for someone like me. But deep down, a small voice continued to whisper that something was terribly, fundamentally wrong with our family. That voice would prove to be my salvation, if I could just learn to trust it over the loud, insistent chorus of their manufactured concern. The cage they had built around me was nearly complete, but they had made one crucial mistake. They had taught me to be intelligent and observant. Those same qualities they praised in my academic work would eventually become the tools I used to recognize the prison they had constructed and, ultimately, to escape it. But first, things would have to get much, much worse. At 16, my world existed within a radius of approximately 2 miles from our house, the distance between home and school, with carefully monitored stops at the grocery store and church. But it was during my junior year of high school that I encountered someone who would become the first person to see through my parents' carefully constructed narrative. Her name was Sarah Chen, and she would change everything. Sarah was my lab partner in advanced biology, assigned randomly by our teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez. Unlike the other friends I had managed to keep, those who had passed my parents' impossible standards, Sarah came into my life without their permission or approval. She was brilliant, funny, and possessed an unnerving ability to see past the surface of things. It started with small observations. She noticed how I flinched when someone raised their voice, even in normal conversation. She saw how I checked my phone obsessively, responding to my mother's texts within seconds. She observed that I never spoke about weekend plans or after-school activities, and that I became visibly anxious whenever our lab work ran past the final bell. "Emma," she said one day as we were cleaning up our microscopes, "can I ask you something? And please don't take this the wrong way, but are you okay? Like, really okay?" The question hit me like a physical blow. No one had ever asked me that before, not in a way that suggested they actually wanted to hear the answer. I felt tears spring to my eyes unexpectedly, and I quickly looked away, pretending to be very interested in washing our equipment. "I'm fine," I said automatically, the response so practiced it felt scripted. "Why would you ask that?" Sarah studied my face with the same intensity she brought to examining cell structures under our microscope. "Because you act like someone who's afraid all the time, and I've noticed that your mom texts you constantly during school." "Like, constantly? That's not normal, Emma." The words "not normal" echoed in my head. For so long I had been told that everything in my life was perfectly normal, just more caring, more protective than other families. But hearing someone my own age, someone with no agenda, point out these patterns made something shift inside me. Over the following weeks, Sarah and I grew closer. She invited me to study sessions at the public library, which I had to decline. She suggested we grab coffee after school, which was impossible given my rigid schedule. She mentioned a movie she wanted to see over the weekend, and I found myself making excuses that sounded hollow even to me. "Your parents are really strict, huh?" she said one afternoon, as we walked toward the parking lot where my father waited in his silver sedan, engine running, watching us through the windshield. "They just care about me," I replied, but the words felt stale in my mouth. "They want to keep me safe." Sarah followed my gaze to where my father sat watching us, his expression unreadable behind his sunglasses. "Emma, that's not caring. That's something else." That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Sarah's words replaying in my mind. I thought about my classmates, relationships with their parents, the easy conversations I overheard, the casual way they made plans, their ability to walk home from school or stay late for clubs without causing a crisis. For the first time, I allowed myself to truly consider the possibility that my family might not be normal, that the level of control and surveillance I lived under might not be protection at all, but something darker. The next day, I did something I had never done before. I asked Sarah about her family life. What I learned shattered my understanding of what parent-child relationships could look like. Sarah's parents trusted her to make good decisions. They worried about her, sure, but they didn't track her every movement or demand detailed explanations for minor deviations from routine. They had never installed cameras in her room or required her to text them every hour. When she made mistakes, they talked to her about consequences, rather than creating elaborate narratives about her psychological instability. "Wait," Sarah said when I mentioned my parents' concerns about my episodes and behavioral issues. "What episodes?" "Emma, you're like the most level-headed person I know. You've never even raised your voice in the 2 months we've been friends." Hearing her say this felt like stepping into sunlight after years in darkness. Someone else saw me, the real me, and found me to be normal, even admirable, not broken, not damaged, not in need of constant supervision and control. Emboldened by Sarah's perspective, I began to pay closer attention to the details of my restrictions. I started noticing things that had always been there, but that I had been trained not to question, the way my mother intercepted phone calls before they reached me. The fact that I had never been allowed to have social media accounts, for my own protection. The elaborate explanations for why I couldn't participate in any school activities that would require staying late or traveling. Sarah offered to help me research what healthy family dynamics looked like. She printed out articles about normal teenage development and appropriate parental boundaries. She found resources about psychological abuse and controlling behavior. As I read these materials in secret, hiding them inside my textbooks, I began to recognize my family in every description of dysfunctional relationships. But my parents had not maintained their control for 16 years by being careless. Somehow, they discovered my friendship with Sarah had deepened beyond casual school interaction. I never learned exactly how, whether through the cameras in my room, monitoring of my school email, or simply their uncanny ability to sense when I was beginning to think for myself. The intervention was swift and devastating. My mother scheduled a meeting with our school guidance counselor, Mrs. Patterson, expressing concern about Sarah's negative influence on her emotionally vulnerable daughter. She painted me as a troubled teenager who was easily manipulated by stronger personalities, and Sarah as a troublemaker who was filling my head with inappropriate ideas about family relationships. Within a week, Sarah and I were no longer lab partners. Mrs. Rodriguez, clearly having received guidance from the administration, paired me with a different student. Sarah tried to maintain our friendship, but my parents had also contacted her parents, sharing their version of events, that I was a deeply troubled girl who was becoming obsessed with their daughter in an unhealthy way. The last conversation I had with Sarah took place in the hallway between classes. She looked confused and hurt, clearly struggling to reconcile what her parents had told her with the person she knew me to be. "Emma, I don't understand what's happening," she said quietly. "My parents say your mom is worried about you, that maybe you're having some kind of breakdown. But that doesn't make sense. You're not having a breakdown. You're just trapped." I wanted to explain, to beg her not to abandon me, to tell her that she was the first person who had ever truly seen me. But I could feel my mother's eyes on me from across the hallway where she had quite coincidentally arrived for a parent-teacher conference. "Maybe they're right," I heard myself saying, the words tasting like poison. "Maybe I am having problems. Maybe you should stay away from me." The look of betrayal on Sarah's face haunts me still. She had extended genuine friendship and concern, and I had thrown it back at her because I was too broken to recognize the lifeline she represented. After that, the isolation intensified. My parents had successfully eliminated the one person who had seen through their facade, and they made sure I understood the consequences of allowing anyone else to get too close. But Sarah had planted something in my mind that they couldn't completely erase, the knowledge that other ways of living existed, that their version of love was not the only version, and that somewhere out there were people who would see me as I really was, not as the damaged, fragile creature they insisted I was. That knowledge would sustain me through the darkest period that was yet to come. By my 17th birthday, the weight of my existence had become unbearable. The knowledge that Sarah had given me, that other families lived differently, that my situation was not normal, burned inside me like a constant flame. But with that awareness came an even more crushing realization. I was completely powerless to change my circumstances. The months following Sarah's removal from my life brought new restrictions that felt more like preparation for total imprisonment than protection. My bedroom door now had a lock installed on the outside, which my parents claimed was to prevent me from wandering at night during episodes that existed only in their increasingly elaborate fiction about my mental state. They had begun giving me pills each morning and evening, small white tablets that my mother said were prescribed by Dr. Martinez to help with my, quote, anxiety and mood regulation. I had never met this doctor, never been to any appointment where such medication was discussed, but questioning this brought only more concerned looks and gentle explanations about how denial was part of my condition. The medication made me foggy and tired. My once sharp mind felt wrapped in cotton, and concentrating in class became increasingly difficult. Teachers who had once praised my academic performance now looked at me with worry, easily accepting my mother's explanations about medication adjustments for my ongoing treatment. It was during this period of chemical-induced compliance that I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to escape. The plan formed slowly, carefully, during the few moments of clarity I could manage, by pretending to swallow the pills while actually tucking them under my tongue. I had been secretly saving small amounts of money from the minimal allowance my parents provided, hiding the bills inside a hollowed-out book, a trick I had learned from a novel I'd read years earlier. I researched bus routes and youth shelters during the brief moments I could access a computer at school, memorizing addresses and phone numbers, since I couldn't risk writing anything down. I learned about emancipation laws and discovered that at 17, I had some legal options if I could just get away from their immediate control. The night I chose for my escape was a Thursday in November. I had been planning for weeks, waiting for the right conditions. My parents had settled into their evening routine, my father watching the news in his recliner, my mother organizing her endless files in her home office. The house was quiet, except for the familiar sounds of their predictable schedule. I had spent months carefully loosening the new security measures on my bedroom window. The metal bars they had installed could be partially removed if you knew which screws to work on gradually over time. The lock mechanism, while complex, had a weakness I had discovered through patient observation. At 11:30 p.m., I put my plan into motion. I had packed a small backpack with essentials, a change of clothes, my hidden money, and copies of my identification documents that I had slowly gathered. I worked silently on the window, my hands trembling with a mixture of fear and anticipation. For the first time in years, I felt the cold night air on my face through an open window. The sensation was so overwhelming that I nearly cried with relief. I was actually going to do this. I was going to be free. I made it exactly 4 blocks from our house before my father's silver sedan pulled alongside me on Maple Street. He didn't speak as he rolled down the passenger window. He didn't have to. The look on his face was a mixture of disappointment and something that looked almost like relief, as if my escape attempt had confirmed something he already knew would happen. I stood on the sidewalk, my small backpack clutched to my chest, staring at him through the car window. For a moment, neither of us moved. I could have run. I could have screamed for help. But 17 years of conditioning are not easily overcome in a moment of crisis. "Get in the car, Emma," he said quietly. And I did. The drive home was silent, except for the sound of my mother's voice on his cell phone, which was on speaker. She was already calling the police, her voice thick with theatrical tears as she reported that her mentally disturbed daughter had run away during, quote, one of her episodes. "She's not well, officer," I heard her saying as we pulled into our driveway. "We've been trying to get her proper treatment, but she refuses to acknowledge her condition. We're so worried she might hurt herself. Or someone else." The next morning brought consequences I should have anticipated, but somehow hadn't fully prepared for. My bedroom door now had a deadbolt installed on the outside. My window was not just secured, but completely sealed. They had used some kind of industrial adhesive around the frame that made it impossible to open even a crack. But the most devastating change was the increase in medication. The morning and evening pills were joined by a 3rd dose at lunch, delivered personally by my mother, who now insisted on watching me swallow them and checking my mouth afterward to ensure compliance. "This is for your own good, sweetheart," she said as she held the glass of water to my lips. "The doctor says your attempted flight response indicates that we need to be more aggressive with your treatment." The new medication regimen left me barely functional. I could hardly stay awake during classes, and when I was conscious, everything felt surreal and distant. My grades plummeted. Teachers who had once known me as an engaged, intelligent student now saw only a troubled teenager, whose concerned parents were doing everything possible to help her. The narrative of my mental instability was now firmly established in our community. I was no longer Emma Carter, honor student with a bright future. I had become that poor girl with the devoted parents who are sacrificing so much to care for their troubled child. People looked at me with pity when they saw me during the rare occasions I was allowed out of the house. Some looked away entirely, uncomfortable with whatever they imagined was wrong with me. No one questioned why I was never seen without my parents hovering nearby, why I seemed to shrink into myself more each day, or why a 17-year-old girl appeared to have no independence whatsoever. My escape attempt had backfired spectacularly. Instead of gaining freedom, I had provided my parents with proof of my instability and justification for even tighter control. They had successfully convinced everyone, including, on my darkest days, myself, that I was too damaged to exist independently. But there was one unintended consequence of my failed escape that my parents couldn't have anticipated. A neighbor had witnessed my brief flight to freedom that night. Mrs. Davidson, who lived in the house behind ours, had been letting her dog out when she saw me walking quickly down the street with a backpack. She had seen my father's car pull up beside me, had watched me get in willingly, and had found the whole interaction strange enough to remember. Mrs. Davidson was a retired social worker who had spent 30 years helping troubled families. Something about what she had witnessed nagged at her, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what felt wrong. A 17-year-old running away wasn't unusual, but the way my father had been waiting, as if he knew exactly where to find me, struck her as odd. She began paying more attention to our family after that night. She noticed patterns that others missed. How I was never in our backyard alone, how my parents always seemed to be watching when I appeared at our windows, how quickly I would disappear from view if anyone tried to speak to me directly. Mrs. Davidson didn't know it yet, but she was gathering pieces of a puzzle that would prove crucial when everything finally came crashing down. For now, though, I was more trapped than ever, and the medication made it nearly impossible to formulate any new plans for escape. My 17th year ended with me more isolated, more controlled, and more convinced of my own brokenness than ever before. But sometimes, in the brief moments of clarity between doses, I would remember Sarah's words, "You're not having a breakdown, you're just trapped." That distinction would prove to be more important than I could have imagined. The years between 18 and 22 passed in a medicated haze that I now recognize as the most dangerous period of my captivity. Legally an adult, I possessed none of the practical means to exercise my freedom. The world outside our colonial home had become an abstract concept rather than a place I could actually access. My high school graduation was a surreal experience. I walked across the stage in a fog of pharmaceutical compliance, accepting my diploma while my parents beamed with pride from the audience. Teachers and administrators praised their dedication to their special needs daughter, commenting on how fortunate I was to have such supportive parents who never gave up on me despite my challenges. College was presented as impossible given my condition, but my mother graciously arranged for me to take online courses through the local community college. She selected my classes, basic subjects that wouldn't overwhelm my supposedly fragile mental state, and monitored every assignment, every discussion post, every interaction with my virtual classmates. "See how we support your education, Emma?" she would say while reviewing my computer history each evening. Most parents wouldn't invest so much time and energy in a child with your difficulties. The difficulties she referred to existed entirely in their manufactured reality, but after years of gaslighting and chemical suppression, even I sometimes questioned whether my perceptions of imprisonment were distorted. Was I really trapped? Or was I actually receiving the specialized care I needed? The doubt was by design, a product of systematic psychological manipulation that had been refined over decades. But during my online psychology courses, something began to shift. Despite the medication fog, despite years of conditioning, despite my own self-doubt, certain concepts in my coursework resonated with startling clarity. When we studied emotional abuse, psychological control, and gaslighting techniques, I found myself silently crying during lectures, recognizing my own life in the clinical descriptions. My professor, Dr. Amanda Wells, was teaching a unit on family systems and psychological manipulation when she presented a case study that felt like she was describing my existence. She talked about isolation tactics, medical abuse through unnecessary medication, and the creation of false narratives about mental illness to justify control. During a required video conference for my family dynamics course, Dr. Wells seemed to pick up on something in my responses to questions about healthy boundaries and autonomous decision-making. My answers were too knowledgeable, too specific, too personal, for someone who was supposedly just learning these concepts academically. "Emma," she said at the end of our call, "I'm going to email you some additional resources about family systems that some of my students find helpful for their studies." The email that arrived the next day contained links about domestic abuse hidden within resources about academic research opportunities. I understood immediately that she suspected something about my situation. For the first time in years, I felt seen by someone who might actually be able to help. I began secretly researching my options. My transcription work, approved by my parents because it could be monitored and didn't require leaving the house, paid me directly to a PayPal account. I started diverting small amounts to a bank account I opened, using information from Dr. Wells, resource links, building what I hoped would eventually become an escape fund. I memorized phone numbers for domestic violence shelters, unable to write them down for fear of discovery. I researched legal aid services and learned about emergency protective orders. Most importantly, I began the careful process of reducing my medication intake, pretending to swallow the pills while actually hiding them in a small container I kept concealed in my room. As the medication cleared from my system over several months, my mind sharpened for the first time in years. The clarity was both exhilarating and terrifying. I could think clearly, but I could also see my situation with devastating accuracy. I was 22 years old, completely isolated from the world, with no friends, no support system, and parents who would rather see me dead than independent. It was during this period of mental clarity that I formed an unlikely alliance with our neighbor, Mrs. Davidson. She had been watching our family with growing concern since my failed escape attempt at 17. Her social work background had trained her to recognize patterns of abuse, and she had been documenting behaviors that others dismissed as normal parental protectiveness. Our communication began accidentally. I was in our backyard during one of my rare supervised outdoor periods when my mother was distracted by a phone call. Mrs. Davidson approached our shared fence, ostensibly to tend her garden, but spoke quietly without looking directly at me. "Are you all right, dear?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "I mean, really all right?" Before I could respond, my mother appeared beside me, her arm sliding around my shoulders in what would appear to be an affectionate gesture but felt like a restraint. "Emma has some special challenges," my mother told Mrs. Davidson with practiced sympathy. "We have to be very careful with her behavioral triggers. You understand." Mrs. Davidson nodded politely, but I caught something in her expression: doubt. She didn't believe my mother's performance, and that small moment of recognition gave me hope. Over the following weeks, I managed to slip brief notes through a loose board in our fence during my supervised outdoor time. The messages were desperate and concise. "Help me. I'm not sick. They're keeping me prisoner." Mrs. Davidson responded with tiny folded papers left in the same gap. She believed me. More importantly, she had connections in the social services community and was willing to help me develop a plan to escape safely. But my parents had not maintained control for over 2 decades by being careless. I never learned exactly how they discovered our communication, whether through their hidden cameras, my mother's constant vigilance, or simply the paranoid intuition of people whose entire lives revolved around controlling mine. One evening, my father entered my room, holding one of Mrs. Davidson's notes. His expression was calmer than I expected, which somehow made it more terrifying. "Who is trying to take you away from us, Emma?" he asked, his voice eerily controlled. "Who has been feeding your delusions about not needing our care?" That night, they took everything: my computer, my phone, even my textbooks from the online classes. My father installed multiple deadbolts on my bedroom door and began what I now understand was their preparation for the final solution to their Emma problem. I overheard them talking in hushed voices about residential treatment facilities, about transferring guardianship, about more intensive interventions for my deteriorating condition. I realized with horrifying clarity that they were planning to have me institutionalized permanently, to transfer their home prison to a more official one, where their narrative of my mental instability would be accepted without question. But they had made one crucial error in their final crackdown. In their haste to eliminate my means of communication and escape, they had overlooked the prepaid cell phone I had purchased months earlier during a supervised shopping trip. I had hidden it in a heating vent in my room, using it only when absolutely certain I was unobserved. The battery was nearly dead, and I had no charger, but I preserved it for what I knew would be my last chance. I understood with perfect clarity that I needed to escape soon, or I would disappear into whatever institution they had chosen, becoming another tragic case of a mentally ill young woman whose devoted parents had finally been forced to seek professional help. What I didn't know was how soon my opportunity would come, or that it would arrive in the form of flames and smoke and a desperate 911 call that would finally expose the truth about my imprisonment. The night everything changed was approaching faster than I could have imagined, and with it, the most terrifying and liberating experience of my life. The night that would either kill me or set me free began like any other in our house of carefully orchestrated routines. My parents conducted their usual evening ritual, checking locks, administering my medication, and securing me in my room for the night. I had become expert at pretending to swallow the pills while actually tucking them under my tongue, spitting them into tissues once I was alone. It was a small act of rebellion that kept my mind clearer than they intended. I fell into a restless sleep around midnight, only to wake suddenly at 2:47 a.m. to an unusual sound from downstairs. The red numbers on my bedside clock glowed ominously in the darkness as I sat up, straining to identify what had disturbed my sleep. At first I thought it might be my father doing one of his middle-of-the-night security checks. He sometimes roamed the house at odd hours, testing windows and doors, checking the surveillance equipment that had become as much a part of our home as the furniture. But this sound was different. A soft crackling noise followed by what sounded like something falling. Then I smelled it. Smoke. Faint at first, then increasingly acrid and unmistakable. My initial reaction was surprisingly calm, almost automatic. Fire safety had been drilled into us at school, and the procedure was ingrained in my memory. Get low, find an exit, call for help. I slid out of bed and crawled toward my bedroom door, already feeling the temperature in the room beginning to rise. When I touched the doorknob, it was warm but not yet hot. I turned it, expecting to enter the hallway and find my parents already managing the emergency. The knob turned freely, but the door wouldn't budge. I pushed harder, then realized with growing panic that it wasn't just the deadbolts. Something heavy had been placed against it from the outside. "Mom! Dad!" I called out, my voice higher than normal but still controlled. "There's a fire! I can't get out of my room." Silence. I pressed my ear to the door and heard movement downstairs. The sound of footsteps, voices too muffled to understand. But no one was coming to help me. I pounded on the door, shouting louder, "Help! The house is on fire! I'm locked in!" The smoke was growing thicker now, seeping under my door in sinister gray tendrils. I grabbed a towel from my adjoining bathroom and stuffed it into the gap, but it provided only temporary relief. My eyes began to water, my throat constricting as the acrid air filled my lungs. I moved to my window, the logical escape route despite the security measures. My room was on the second floor, but there was a lower roof section that extended beneath my window. If I could get out, I might be able to reach it and climb down to safety. I grasped the window frame and pulled upward, knowing it would be difficult but still hopeful that adrenaline might give me the strength to overcome whatever locks they had installed. But the window didn't move at all. In the dim light filtering through my curtains, I could see why, and the sight filled me with a terror unlike anything I had ever experienced. Fresh nails had been hammered through the window frame, at intervals of just a few inches, securing it completely to the casing. Some kind of industrial sealant created a dark outline around the entire perimeter, making the window as immovable as if it had been welded shut. The understanding hit me like a physical blow. This had been planned. The sealed window, the barricaded door, the convenient timing of a fire in the middle of the night. This wasn't an accident or negligence. This was intentional. Panic surged through me as the horrible truth crystallized. They wanted me to die in this fire. I grabbed my desk chair and slammed it against the window with desperate fury, but the reinforced glass barely shuddered. The nails held firm, unmoved by my frantic efforts. Again and again I struck, creating tiny spiderweb cracks but making no real progress toward escape. The smoke was getting thicker by the minute. I could hear the fire now, a hungry roar from somewhere below me. The floor beneath my feet was growing warm. I dropped to my hands and knees, remembering that cleaner air would be near the floor. and crawled back to the window. That's when I saw them. In the driveway below, illuminated by our automatic security lights, I watched my parents loading suitcases into the trunk of our silver sedan. They moved with calm efficiency, not like people fleeing a sudden emergency, but like people executing a carefully planned departure. They were leaving. They were leaving me to die in a burning house. My mother closed the trunk and got into the passenger seat while my father took one last look at the house. Even from my second-floor window, even through the smoke and my tears, I could see his face clearly in the bright security lighting. There was no panic, no distress, no indication that he was abandoning his daughter to a horrible death. There was only the same calm resolve I had seen when he installed locks on my bedroom door. He got into the car, and they drove away. I began screaming then. Raw, primal sounds of terror and betrayal that tore at my smoke-damaged throat. I threw myself against the door, clawed at the sealed window, searched frantically for anything that might break through the prison they had created around me. Through my panic, I remembered the prepaid phone hidden in the heating vent. My lifeline. My last hope. I scrambled across the room, the smoke now so thick I could barely see my own hands. The metal grate was hot to the touch, but I pried it open with fingers that were already beginning to blister from the rising temperature. The small phone was there, miraculously still showing a partial battery charge. My hands shook violently as I dialed 911, coughing so hard I could barely speak when the dispatcher answered. 911, what's your emergency? Fire, I gasped, my voice barely recognizable. I'm trapped. 847 Colonial Drive, second-floor bedroom. I can't get out. Is there a fire in your home, ma'am? Are there other people in the house? Yes, fire, I confirmed, my words broken by violent coughing fits. No people, my parents left. They locked me in. The windows are nailed shut, I can't get out. There was a brief pause, as if the dispatcher was processing information that didn't fit normal emergency patterns. Did you say the windows are nailed shut? Yes, I screamed, abandoning any attempt at composure. They nailed my windows shut. I can't get out. They want me to die. I could hear sirens in the distance as the dispatcher assured me that help was coming, but the smoke was so dense now that I could barely see across my room. The heat was intense, pressing against my skin like a physical weight. I crawled to the corner farthest from the door, pressing a wet cloth against my mouth and nose, fighting to stay conscious. Through my window, I saw the first fire truck arrive, followed quickly by an ambulance and police cars. I heard shouting outside, though the words were indistinct through the thick glass and my own labored breathing. Then I heard Mrs. Davidson's voice from next door, screaming my name. Emma! Oh God, Emma! She was pointing frantically at my window as firefighters swarmed the scene. I crawled back to the window and pounded on the glass with what little strength I had left. Through my oxygen-starved vision, I could see Mrs. Davidson directing the firefighters, attention upward, her face a mask of horror as she realized what was happening. The next few minutes exist in my memory as fragments. The sound of breaking glass, the blessed rush of cooler air, figures in protective gear appearing at my window. I remember seeing shock on their faces, visible even through their masks, as they registered the nails that had sealed my escape route. Strong arms lifted me. Someone was saying something about a ladder. I was being carried down, the sensation of movement disorienting after so many hours of confinement. The cool night air hit my damaged lungs, causing a coughing fit so violent I thought I might break apart. But it was the most beautiful sensation I had ever experienced, the feeling of breathing air that didn't burn, of being outside the prison that had nearly become my tomb. I remember fragments of the next hour. Oxygen being placed over my face, the sharp pain of an IV being inserted, Mrs. Davidson's tear-streaked face appearing above me as she squeezed my hand. Most vividly, I remember my parents returning to the scene, just as the ambulance was preparing to leave. Their performance began immediately. My mother's theatrical wailing, my father's shocked expression, both of them rushing toward the ambulance with perfectly practiced concern. "Our daughter!" My mother cried to anyone who would listen. "Is she okay? We went for help when the smoke alarms failed. We tried to call the fire department from our car. Through my oxygen mask, I whispered the truth to the paramedic beside me. They locked me in. They nailed the window shut. They left me to die. His expression shifted from professional concern to something darker, as he looked from me to my hysterical parents being held back by police officers. He leaned closer and spoke quietly. We found the nails. Fresh hammer marks. We saw the furniture pushed against your door, and we heard the 911 recording. No one is going to hurt you anymore. As consciousness began to fade, I heard a police officer speaking to my parents in a tone I had never heard anyone use with them before. Hard, suspicious, demanding. We need to ask you some questions about those windows, Mr. and Mrs. Carter, and about this recording from the 911 call, where your daughter says you nailed her in and left her to die. For the first time in my life, my mother's performance wasn't working. Her voice rose in indignation. Our daughter is mentally disturbed. She has delusions. We would never hurt her. But the last thing I heard before darkness claimed me was the most beautiful sound I had ever experienced, the click of handcuffs around my mother's wrists. The prison was finally broken. The truth was finally free. I woke up in Hartford General Hospital 3 days later, my throat raw from smoke inhalation and my lungs damaged but healing. The first face I saw wasn't my mother's or father's. It was Mrs. Davidson, sitting in the chair beside my hospital bed with dark circles under her eyes that suggested she had barely left my side. "They're in custody," were her first words to me, answering the question I hadn't yet found the strength to ask. "Both of them. They're not getting anywhere near you ever again." Detective Maria Santos came to see me that afternoon. She was a woman in her 40s, with kind eyes and a direct manner that I found comforting after years of navigating my parents' manipulation. She sat beside my bed, notepad ready but initially unused, and simply asked how I was feeling. "I need to ask you some questions, Emma," she finally said. "But first, I want you to know that we found evidence that supports everything you said during that 911 call. The hammer marks on your window frames were fresh, made within days of the fire. We found the sealant, still tacky around the edges. We documented the furniture that had been pushed against your bedroom door from the outside." I closed my eyes briefly, a mixture of relief and pain washing over me. For so long, I had been told that my perceptions were unreliable, that my memories couldn't be trusted, that my fears were delusions. Having external validation of what I had experienced was both vindicating and devastating. Detective Santos was patient as I shared my story, beginning with my earliest memories of control and isolation. She took notes, but more importantly, she listened without judgment as I described the escalating restrictions, the fake medications, the surveillance, and finally the horrifying realization that my parents had been willing to let me burn to death rather than lose control over me. "We can't prove yet that they started the fire deliberately," she told me. "The arson investigator believes it began in the kitchen, possibly electrical, but we can prove they knew about it, left without attempting to rescue you, and had taken deliberate steps to prevent your escape. They've been telling people I'm mentally ill for years," I said, my voice still raspy from smoke damage. "That I have delusions, that I need their protection. Will anyone believe me?" Detective Santos's expression hardened slightly. "The 911 recording is compelling evidence, Emma. Your voice, your terror, your clear statement that they had nailed your windows shut, all captured in real time during the emergency. It's difficult to dismiss that as delusion." She hesitated before continuing. "We executed a search warrant on what remained of your parents' house after the fire. We found medication bottles with your name on them, prescribed by doctors who, when we contacted them, had no record of you as a patient. We also found your mother's journals." Over the following days, as my physical condition improved, the full scope of the investigation was revealed to me. My mother's journals, recovered from a fireproof safe in their bedroom, contained years of detailed documentation of her treatment of my supposed mental illness, a condition that existed only in her disturbed mind. The forensic psychologist who reviewed the material suggested my mother suffered from Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a disorder where a caregiver fabricates or induces illness in someone under their care to gain attention and sympathy. More chilling were the entries from recent months, where she wrote explicitly about her fear of losing control over me and her determination to maintain her grip on my life, whatever the cost. Your father appears to have been more of an enabler than the primary perpetrator, Detective Santos explained during one of our interviews. He's been cooperating with the investigation, providing details about the progression of your imprisonment. He admits to knowing what was happening was wrong, but claims he was too afraid of your mother to intervene. Mrs. Davidson became a crucial witness, describing her observations of my restricted movements, the supervised backyard visits, and our secret communications. She had preserved copies of the notes I had passed to her, evidence that contradicted my parents' claims about my supposed delusions. I should have done more, she told me, during one of her daily hospital visits, tears streaming down her face. I knew something was terribly wrong, but I didn't know how to help without making things worse for you. You did help, I assured her. You were the only one who saw through their act. You were the only one who believed me. Other neighbors came forward as the case gained media attention, sharing observations they had dismissed or rationalized over the years. Mrs. Kellerman from across the street recalled how she never saw me outside alone, how my mother would interrupt if she tried to speak with me directly. Mr. Torres, who lived 2 doors down, described hearing what sounded like crying from our house late at night, only to be convinced by my mother that I was having night terrors that required careful management. My former teachers were interviewed, many expressing shock and guilt at having accepted my parents' explanations for my increasingly withdrawn behavior and declining academic performance. Dr. Wells, my online psychology professor, provided records of our communications and her own documented concerns about potential abuse. As physical evidence was compiled and witness statements gathered, the prosecution's case against my parents strengthened. The district attorney, Margaret Chen, explained to me that they would be charged with attempted murder, false imprisonment, child abuse for the years before I turned 18, and numerous other crimes. Your mother's journals are particularly damning, she told me. They show premeditation and a complete lack of remorse. In one entry from just weeks before the fire, she wrote about how she would rather see you dead than living independently of her control. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. I had understood that my mother's version of love was twisted and possessive, but having confirmation that she had actually preferred my death to my freedom was still shocking. The preliminary hearing was my first time seeing my parents since the night of the fire. The courtroom felt smaller than I had expected from movies and television, polished wood, fluorescent lighting, the echo of footsteps on hard floors. I sat beside the prosecutor, steeling myself for the side of the people who had given me life, and then tried to take it away. When they entered in handcuffs, they looked older and smaller than in my memories. My mother's eyes found mine immediately, her expression a practiced blend of hurt and confusion that I recognized from years of manipulation. My father looked at the floor, shoulders hunched in defeat. For a moment I felt a flicker of the old guilt they had cultivated in me so carefully. Then I remembered the nails in my window frames, the smoke filling my lungs, their car driving away as flames consumed the house with me trapped inside. The evidence mounted over 3 days of preliminary hearings. The 911 recording played for the court, my desperate voice filling the silent courtroom. They nailed my window shut. I can't get out. They want me to die. Forensic analysis of the window frames. Medical experts testifying about the unnecessary medications. Psychologists explaining the patterns of abuse and control evident in my parents' behavior. My mother maintained her performance throughout, insisting she had only ever tried to protect her, quote, mentally disturbed daughter. She cried on cue, spoke with perfect maternal concern, and expressed confusion about why I would fabricate such terrible accusations. Emma has always had difficulty distinguishing reality from her imagination, she testified. As a child, she would tell elaborate stories that simply weren't true. As she grew older, the stories became darker, more paranoid. We consulted numerous doctors, tried every treatment available. My father's defense took a different approach. His attorney portrayed him as another victim of my mother's psychological manipulation, a weak man who had failed to protect his daughter but who had never actively participated in my imprisonment. I made terrible mistakes, he testified, actually meeting my eyes for the first time. I failed Emma. I should have protected her from Patricia's obsession. I will carry that guilt for the rest of my life. The most difficult moment came when I took the stand. Facing my parents while recounting years of abuse required every ounce of strength I possessed, but I forced myself to look directly at them as I spoke my truth. They told me from childhood that I was mentally unstable, that I needed their protection. I testified, but I was never ill until they began medicating me with drugs I didn't need. I was never in danger until they created the danger. They didn't protect me, they imprisoned me. The turning point came when my mother, under cross-examination, finally lost control of her carefully maintained facade. When confronted with her journal entries about preferring my death to my independence, she began to laugh. A soft, unsettling sound that gradually increased until the judge called for order. She was always going to leave me, my mother said, no longer performing for the jury but speaking directly to me. Just like everyone else. I gave her everything, protected her from the filth of the world, and she wanted to abandon me for so-called independence. She spat the last word like a curse. The courtroom fell silent at this confession. The jury had glimpsed the truth behind her performance, and there was no taking it back. Both parents were bound over for trial on all charges. As they were led away, my mother called out one last time, "You'll never survive without us, Emma. You need us." But her voice held no power over me anymore. The truth had been spoken, heard, and believed. Justice, imperfect but real, was finally within reach. The trial began 6 months after the fire, and I was finally strong enough, both physically and emotionally, to face my parents in court and tell my story to the world. The weeks leading up to it had been filled with therapy sessions with Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a trauma specialist who helped me process not just the acute horror of that night, but the lifetime of psychological abuse that had preceded it. What you experienced was gaslighting in its most extreme form. Drive, Martinez explained during one of our sessions. They systematically undermined your trust in your own perceptions, isolated you from anyone who might validate your reality, and created an alternative narrative about your mental state that served their need for control. The courtroom was packed for the opening statements. Media attention had turned our case into a national conversation about psychological abuse and parental control. I sat beside Prosecutor Margaret Chen, drawing strength from the knowledge that Mrs. Davidson, Dr. Wells, and other supporters filled the benches behind me. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They played the full 911 recording, my voice desperate and choked with smoke echoing through the silent courtroom. "They nailed my window shut. I can't get out. They want me to die." The physical evidence was undeniable. Photographs of the fresh hammer marks in my window frames, the industrial sealant still visible around the edges, the furniture that had been pushed against my bedroom door, medical testimony about years of unnecessary medication that had damaged my cognitive function. But perhaps most damning were my mother's own words, read aloud from her journals by the prosecutor. Entry after entry, detailing her elaborate fiction about my mental illness, her methods of control, and finally, her chilling conclusion that she would, quote, "rather see Emma dead than living independently beyond my care." My mother's defense attorney tried to portray her as a devoted mother, driven to extremes by a daughter's severe mental illness. But when my mother took the stand, her performance finally cracked under the weight of evidence and scrutiny. "Everything I did was out of love," she insisted, tears streaming down her face. Emma was never capable of caring for herself. She needed protection from the world and from her own dangerous impulses. "Mrs. Carter," the prosecutor asked quietly, "if Emma was so mentally ill, why did you never take her to see the doctors who supposedly prescribed her medication?" My mother's pause was telling. She was too fragile for clinical settings. We had to manage her care at home." "And the nails in her bedroom windows? Were those also part of her medical care?" "She was a danger to herself. She might have jumped from a second-story window onto a roof that would have provided a safe exit during the fire that nearly killed her." My mother had no answer that didn't expose her lies. My father's testimony was different, but equally devastating. He admitted to everything: the locks, the surveillance, the fake medications, the nailed windows. But he portrayed himself as another victim of my mother's psychological manipulation. "I knew it was wrong," he said, his voice barely audible. "I knew Emma wasn't sick the way Patricia claimed, but I was afraid to stand up to her. I was weak, and my weakness nearly killed my daughter. When it was my turn to testify, I had been dreading this moment for months. But as I looked out at the courtroom, I saw faces filled with compassion and support, rather than the skepticism I had expected. For the first time in my life, people were ready to hear and believe my truth. I spoke for over 2 hours, detailing the progression from protective parenting to total imprisonment. I described the isolation, the fake medical treatments, the surveillance, the systematic destruction of my relationships with anyone who might have helped me. I spent 22 years believing I was broken, I concluded, looking directly at my parents, believing I needed protection from myself and from the world. But today I stand before you whole and free. I am not here to offer forgiveness. I am here to declare my independence from their control, from their lies, from their twisted version of love. The defense tried to shake my testimony through cross-examination, suggesting that trauma and medication had affected my memories. But I had prepared for this, and my responses were clear and consistent. "You ask if my memory might be unreliable," I said to my mother's attorney. "But we have physical evidence of everything I've described. We have my mother's own journals confirming her motives. And we have that 911 recording of me begging for help while I was literally trapped in a burning room. Those aren't memories, they're documented facts." The jury deliberated for just under 4 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts for both parents. My mother received a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. My father, given his cooperation and testimony, received 35 years with the possibility of parole, after 20. Before they were led away, the judge allowed me to make a final statement. I stood on legs that were steadier than I had expected and faced the people who had controlled my entire existence. "For 22 years, you convinced me that I was incapable of surviving without your protection," I said. "Today marks not just the end of your control over me, but the beginning of the life I was always meant to live. This is the last time I will ever address you, and the first day of a future that belongs entirely to me." As they were escorted out, my mother turned back one final time. "You'll fail without us, Emma," she called out desperately. "You need us." But her words had no power over me anymore. The truth had been spoken, acknowledged, and justice had been served. The transition from surviving to thriving didn't happen overnight. There were days when freedom felt overwhelming, when I questioned my ability to navigate a world I had been systematically taught to fear. There were nights when I woke in panic, convinced I was still trapped in that burning room. But with each passing month, those moments became less frequent and less intense. Dr. Martinez continued to work with me, helping me understand that recovery wasn't about forgetting what happened, but about integrating those experiences without letting them define my future. Mrs. Davidson became more than a neighbor. She became family. She helped me find my first apartment, a bright, airy space where every window opened fully and no door had locks that could trap me inside. She celebrated my small victories, my first solo grocery shopping trip, my first time driving a car, my decision to return to school. "I thought I was brave until I met you," she told me once. "You redefine courage for me every day." I completed my bachelor's degree in psychology and went on to earn a master's in counseling, specializing in trauma recovery. My thesis on psychological abuse within families drew on both personal experience and extensive research. The day I received my diploma, Mrs. Davidson and a group of friends I had made threw me a celebration that left me speechless with gratitude. 2 years after the trial, I established the Emma Carter Foundation, focusing on helping young adults transition out of abusive family situations. We provide practical support, legal resources, and most importantly, community. The isolation that enables abusers to maintain control can be broken through connection with others who understand without explanation. The media attention following the trial brought unexpected connections. Other survivors of family abuse reached out to share their stories. Organizations working with domestic violence victims invited me to speak about psychological control and coercive control. I found purpose in helping others recognize and escape situations similar to what I had experienced. Perhaps the most profound realization has been understanding the true nature of love. Real love expands rather than contracts. It creates space for growth rather than confinement. It trusts rather than suspects. It releases rather than restrains. Today, my life bears no resemblance to the prison of my first 22 years. I work with trauma survivors, sharing tools for recovery. I travel, experiencing the world my parents insisted was too dangerous for me to enter. I form relationships based on mutual respect rather than control disguised as protection. The nightmares have not completely disappeared, but they no longer control my days. The psychological wounds have formed scars that occasionally ache but no longer bleed. I carry my history not as a burden but as hard-won wisdom about human capacity for both cruelty and resilience. Every window in my home opens fully, without locks or barriers of any kind. That simple fact represents the safety I have created for myself. Safety that comes from within, rather than being imposed from without. On warm summer evenings, I sometimes sit by my open window, feeling the breeze on my face, and acknowledge how far I have traveled from that smoke-filled room, with its nailed-shut windows and seemingly sealed future. 5 years after the fire, I received a letter from my father in prison. He apologized, expressed remorse, and asked for a chance to rebuild some kind of relationship. I read the letter once, then filed it away without responding. Forgiveness may come someday, but it will be on my terms, in my time, if at all. My mother has never acknowledged wrongdoing or shown genuine remorse. According to her attorney, she maintains that she was a devoted mother whose ungrateful daughter has destroyed her life with lies and manipulation. Even now, she cannot see me as anything other than her possession, but her inability to accept reality no longer has the power to hurt me. I know who I am. I know what happened. I know what I survived, and I know what I have built from the ashes of that old life. If you are reading this and recognize your own life in any part of my story, please know that you are not alone. Trust your perceptions. They are valid. Document what is happening to you. Reach out for help, even if previous attempts have failed. Freedom is possible. Healing is possible. A life reclaimed from control is not only possible, it is your birthright. The most important voice to trust is your own, and the most important truth to hold on to is this: you deserve to live without fear, to love without conditions, and to exist as the complete, autonomous person you were always meant to be. My name is Emma Carter. I survived. I escaped. I healed. And I am finally, truly free.